Okay, good evening, everyone. I'm Robert Doar, president of the American Enterprise Institute, and I want to thank you all for coming to tonight's important event on the state of the American family. One thing that I've observed in my own career in social services and also in my own family is how strong, stable families can strengthen us all, including and especially children in poverty. In my own case, I don't often talk about this, but I grew up in a family in which my parents were divorced when I was 7 years old. And that was difficult and complicated and hard for our family, and my parents had to make a number of very challenging changes to their life in order to address the shortcomings that were caused by the fact that they lived apart. And it's also true for children raised in households without both parents that are active and involved, for all children, parents that are committed for the long haul. The consequences of parental absence can be severe. Children raised in one-parent families are 4 to 5 times as likely to be poor, they do less well in school, and they are more likely to participate in dangerous behaviors as they grow up. The reason for the success of two-parents' homes is not complicated. Parents who work together as a team to raise a child have more resources at their disposal, including both time and money, which allows them to give children the affection and support that they need. And on that count, we have much to be optimistic about. Divorce rates continue to fall, as they have for the past 40 years, and recent reports suggest that public support for divorce is also falling. At the same time, fewer children are being born to single mothers, while more are being raised in married families. For 10 consecutive years now, the birth rate for unmarried women has declined. At the same time, the share of children raised in intact homes has increased for the past 5 years. These are all good signs. And in my opinion, we owe much of these trends to the public intellectuals who have been supporting strong family formation for decades. Across the political spectrum, policy leaders and academics have argued for many years that the American family is one of the most important and effective tools for fighting poverty and building a community. The list of these figures is long and impressive. Liberals and conservatives alike have recognized the positive impact of a stable family for a child's development and prospects for future success. Daniel Patrick Moynihan understood that the family is the basic social unit of American life. Princeton's Sarah McClanahan and Brookings Bell Sawhill acknowledged that when it comes to promoting equal opportunity for all Americans, an intact family with a steadily employed parent that transmits good values to children can produce more successful children. And it's why scholars on both the left and the right, from McClanahan and Ron Mincy to Charles Murray and Robert Rector, have recognized the importance of steady marriages and supportive parents. For decades, political figures have been worrying about the integrity of family life in this country. In the same State of the Union address that he promised to end welfare as we know it, President Clinton said that American family life had been decaying for 3 straight decades. Bell Sawhill more recently worried that marriage, or marriage as we know it, is disappearing, and George Will has pointed out the dangerous consequences of single parenthood in low-income communities. All these figures have disagreed, and often vehemently, on the best ways to address these problems. But the overall consensus is clear. No matter where you come from on the political spectrum, you should recognize that stable American families improve our economy, reduce poverty, enhance mobility, and strengthen our society. The recent trends suggest that these arguments are having a positive effect. And here's the great news. The teen pregnancy rate is down by more than 60% from a decade ago. The divorce rate has fallen almost a quarter over the same period. And the 2018 nonmarital birth rate was 23% lower than it was at its peak in 2007. These important changes tell me that though we have much work to do in the future, these essential lessons are taking root. And the latest champion of the American family in this long line of distinguished policy leaders, commentators, and academics is Brad Wilcox. Dr. Wilcox is a visiting scholar here at AEI, where he directs the Home Economics Projects. He is also a professor of sociology at the University of Virginia and a director of the National Marriage Project. There are few people in America who have done more to speak up for the American family than Dr. Wilcox. Later in the evening, he will be followed by a star-studded panel moderated by our own Yuval Levin. And he'll be joined by David Brooks of the New York Times, Kathy Eden of Princeton, Richard Reeves of Brookings, and Wesley Yang from the Tablet magazine. At AEI, we're firmly dedicated to the competition of ideas. And that competition is only improved when the ideas come from some of our country's brightest and sharpest minds. And they are here tonight. So please join me in beginning tonight's program by welcoming Dr. Brad Wilcox to the stage for opening remarks. Thank you.
I'd like to thank my colleagues at AEI, Robert, for that gracious introduction, Yuval for moderating tonight's discussion later on in the festivities, and Peyton for organizing all of this. I'm profoundly grateful to all of you for the work that you do, and to everyone here at AEI for making conversations like tonight's possible. So we're here tonight to talk about the state of our unions, about the good news and the bad news about marriage and family in America. I'm going to begin tonight by talking about my students at UVA, University of Virginia. You know, they're great. They're curious, they're hardworking, they're friendly, and many of them have big hearts for good causes in Charlottesville, from tutoring poor children in city schools to visiting the elderly at local nursing homes. But they do suffer from one big blind spot. Resume virtues are more salient to them than eulogy virtues, as David Brooks might put it. Talking and thinking about marriage or even dating someone is a rarity among my students at UVA. Quote, UVA students are definitely more focused on their education and getting their career started than getting into a serious relationship, said Holly, a recent graduate. She went on to say, if it happens, great. But the focus is definitely on building your own brands first. The thought process is relationships and love are a risk, but you always have your career and success to fall back on. Holly is not alone. One recent poll found that only 31% of young adults thought marriage was essential to living a fulfilling life, compared to 64% who thought education and 74% who thought making a good living were crucial to fulfillment. And it's, of course, no accident today that so many young adults, like Holly, are leaning away from marriage. Parents, peers, and the pop culture encourage them to put love and marriage on the back burner. The legacy of the divorce revolution has made plenty of them gun-shy about marriage, including women like Holly, whose parents split when she was young. And growing up in the wake of the Great Recession has made countless young adults keen on nailing down a good job and a good income before they even let their minds and hearts drift toward thoughts of marriage, not to mention the baby carriage. But what they don't realize, I think, is that even today in the 21st century, it's still a mistake to prioritize, as Holly does, education and work over marriage. Because for most of us, marriage and family life are much more likely to supply meaning, direction, and happiness than a job or a piece of paper. We can see here, for instance, on the screen, with data from the General Social Survey, that marital status is a markedly better predictor of being very happy in life than is how much you earn or whether or not you got a college degree. And beyond marital status per se, thinking about kind of the quality of married life, what the data tell us is that a good marriage far and away predicts general happiness in America, outpacing in very clear ways on the screen both education and income. In fact, what the screen is telling us is that men and women who are happily married are about 5 times more likely to be happy in life, very happy in life, compared both to their unmarried peers and, of course, to their unhappily married peers. So again, my point here is that there's something about marriage and having a good marriage that are a lot more important for many of us than things like education, work, and income. And this makes sense, I think, if you think about it. You know, as Aristotle taught us, we are social animals. Our family and our friends are much more crucial to our long-term welfare than the amount of money we make or the school that we graduated from. Remember, folks, it's about eulogy virtues, not resume virtues. So this, then, I think, is partly why the state of our unions matters for us adults. As men and women, the vast majority of us are better off when we're in strong and stable unions. But this Aristotelian point just doesn't apply to adults. It also, of course, applies to our kids and to our communities, as Robert Doerr's comments suggested earlier tonight. Because study after study tell us that our kids are happier and healthier when they're raised in stable and reasonably happy homes. They're also much less likely to get into trouble at school, not to mention elsewhere, as this slide here on my left and my right indicates. What's more, what's happening in our families matters for our communities as well. The work of Raj Chetty and his colleagues, among others, tells us that our communities are safest, and the American dream is strongest for poor kids across the land when there are more two-parent families and fewer single-parent families in neighborhoods across the nation. So clearly, the state of our unions also matters for our kids and for the health of our republic. Now, if your only sense of the state of our unions is drawn from the pop culture or the prestige press, you might be thinking that marriage in America is on the ropes. From the critically acclaimed new movie Marriage Story to the equally critically acclaimed new novel Fleischman is in Trouble, we get two, count them, stories about New York marriages ending in divorce. Stories like these could certainly leave you with the impression that marriage today is messy and miserable, and that the descent into divorce is rampant. Or take the messages about marriage we get from the media. The New York Times recently ran an op-ed Beyond Marriage from my friend and eminent family scholar Belle Sawhill, suggesting that marriage is, quote, disappearing, unquote. Elsewhere, she has warned that, quote, marriage is in trouble, and however desirable, will be difficult to restore. But this kind of sobering story, this story that the death of marriage is upon us, has been greatly exaggerated, to paraphrase Mark Twain. The reality is that there is good news to report about the state of our unions and the state of American family life, I think at least for kids. Let's start with kind of the real marriage story about divorce, not the fictional story that was told by Adam Driver and Scarlett Johansson. So when it comes to divorce, I was born in 1970. Clearly came of age amidst the divorce revolution. Almost half of my young friends growing up in Storrs, Connecticut, hailed from divorced families. By the time I headed off to college, most of my other friends' parents had parted ways. Clearly, my experience was not atypical in the nation at large, as the figures to my left and to my right indicate. But this year, in 2020, my wife and I will be celebrating 25 years of married love. And most of our friends are on a similar trajectory. Unless you think I'm atypical in this regard, even the New York Times ran a story a couple of years ago on how, quote, divorce lost its groove, spotlighting moms in Seattle and Park Slope, talking about how divorce had become déclassé in their circles. Of course, Seattle and Park Slope are not exactly hotbeds of social conservatism. So today, what we're seeing, up on the screens to your left and to your right, sort of tell us that we're back to 1970 levels of divorce. And family scholars who are kind of studying these trends tell us that the divorce rate's likely to head even lower. Okay, so that's part of the good news about marriage in America tonight. A second piece of good news is that we're seeing a pretty big shift in nonmarital births as well. Of course, starting in the 1960s, the share of kids who were born outside of wedlock seemed to go up and up and up. Many of us thought that it would kind of never cease to go up and up and up. But clearly, in the wake of the Great Recession, there's been a shift where slightly fewer kids today are being born outside of marriage today as compared to before the Great Recession hit this country. So if you put less divorce together with less non-marital childbearing, what that equals, obviously, is more stable married families for American kids. And since 2014, as this slide up here on my left and my right tells us, we've seen a slight increase in the share of kids being raised by their own married parents. So this is kind of the third piece of good news for marriage in America and for families in this country. So again, for children, I think the story is that the death of marriage has been greatly exaggerated because a growing share of kids are poised to benefit from being raised by their own married parents. It's also worth noting here, of course, too, that for folks who are getting married today, that the prospects of divorce are diminished and the prospects of marital success are increased for those married Americans, which again is also good news. But the news is not entirely good tonight. And I think when it comes to adults, there are kind of some sobering signs on the horizon to be thinking about. Because for adults, what we're seeing is that marriage is losing ground as the anchor of American adulthood, with more women and men postponing marriage, getting divorced, or avoiding it all together entirely. One sign of this, of course, is that the marriage rate has fallen more than 50% over the course of the last half century. So as a consequence of all this, demographers predict that the share of Americans who will ever marry has fallen from about 80% for Gen Xers to about 70% for millennials. This downward dip in marriage means that a large minority of men and women will never tie the knot. It also means, of course, that there are plenty of older Americans who will spend time today, either for reasons of divorce or because they've never married, spending their last 10, 20, or 30 years of life without a partner, as this figure here to my left and to my right suggests. It's basically depicting the share of adults 60 and older who are either divorced or never married from the early 70s to the present. You can see it's increased from about 5% to about 25% today, a pretty dramatic increase. Now, not only are we sort of seeing that marriage is less likely to anchor the adult life course, we're also seeing more recently less baby making happening in America. Since the Great Recession, the total fertility rate in the US has fallen from a replacement level of about 2.1 babies per woman to 1.7 babies per woman. That's the lowest our nation has ever witnessed. So we're seeing the lowest fertility we've ever seen in America. And practically what this means is that there are about 1.1 fewer kids in America today in 2020 compared to 2010. And this is really kind of a striking statistic that William Freyet Brookings has said on Earth recently. Because as he notes, what you typically see in this country is that the number of kids in America keeps increasing. But that has shifted in the last decade, as this slide tells us. So from my perspective, the bad news about family life in America is that a large minority of men and women will not marry or have children, leaving them without any kin as they head into midlife and later life. In China, there's a term for men without kin, bare branches. In our country, in the coming years, there will be millions of men and women who would also be described as bare branches as they push past 50. One portent of this, as we've already seen, is the share of older Americans living by themselves growing and growing. Now, the problem with this trend can be seen already across the Pacific. The bare branches story has been playing out in Japan for the last 40 years. Japanese fertility hit our current rate in 1987, about 1.7, before falling much, much lower. And it's not been a pretty situation there in the land of what I would call the setting sun. We've got lots of old people and comparatively few young people. And that equals population decline and economic stagnation. And for many older people, many older Japanese, an achingly lonely life. We're seeing more media accounts of thousands upon thousands of older Japanese women and men living in extreme isolation, often left to live and die alone in their final years. In fact, way too many of them now are only discovered in death when a stench comes from their apartment or when their bills go unpaid for months. In the words of one especially harrowing New York Times story on this, quote, "The extreme isolation of elderly Japanese is so common that an entire industry has emerged around it, specializing in cleaning out apartments where decomposing remains are found." This, then, is but one of the dangers of letting marriage and fertility head into free fall for a society. Now, in making sense of the good news and the bad news, of trying to sort of reconcile these two different stories that I'm telling tonight, I think we have to sort of see how a lot of this story is about selection, about how in the wake of the divorce revolution and so many other social changes, marriage has become more selective, and how since the Great Recession, parenthood in America has become more selective. So what's happening here is that our use of contraception is getting more consistent. Our electronic entertainments are becoming ever more diverting. Our expectations of marriage are extraordinarily high. Working class men's wages are often too stagnant, and young adults have become more cautious about taking big risks. So these kinds of things working in concert mean that Americans are pairing off and welcoming new life less and less. On the one hand, again, this is good news because it means that more kids have the benefit of what Richard Reeves calls two highly invested parents. But on the other hand, it also means that many men and women don't benefit from the direction, meaning, and solidarity afforded by putting a ring on it or parenthood. Now, I've sketched out the big picture tonight when it comes to the state of our unions. But it's clear that some Americans are doing better at marriage and family life, and some Americans are doing worse. And the usual custom in situations like this is to focus on those Americans who are struggling. But I'm not going to do that tonight. I'm going to close our discussion of the state of our unions by focusing on those men and women who could be called the masters of marriage, who are forging strong and stable marriages in the 21st century, partly so we can think constructively about how to give all Americans a better shot at forging strong and stable families of their own. Now, if I was a psychologist, I might determine the masters of marriage by doing what Dr. John Gottman did in 1986, when he opened what came to be known as the Love Lab at the University of Washington in Seattle. The Love Lab was a well-appointed apartment on the UW campus overlooking a canal connecting to Lake Washington. It was used by Gottman and his colleagues to study the ingredients that led to marital success or marital failure for hundreds of couples who went through the Love Lab, depicted here up on our screens. So Gottman talked about the Love Lab this way. He said, quote, "It had a beautiful picture window there, boats going by, and people just sort of listened to the music they wanted to listen to, watched television, brought newspapers to read, did whatever they wanted to do." He added, "The only difference between the Love Lab and an ordinary bed and breakfast was we had 4 cameras bolted to the wall, and there were monitors that measured 2 channels of electrocardiograms, and when they urinated, we took a urine sample to measure stress hormones." So doing all of this with literally hundreds of couples in his lab in Seattle, he came up with a couple of key ingredients that were associated with marital success and with marital failure. In fact, he was able to predict with more than 90% accuracy which couples going through his lab would end up divorced and which ones would not. So the takeaways that he came up with from his work in the Love Lab are articulated up on the screen to my left and to my right. Part of the story here was encouraging folks to avoid the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. That was his term for 4 behaviors in marriage that were deeply problematic. Things like stonewalling, more common for guys, and things like sustained criticism, more common for gals. Things like defensiveness and contempt. These were the 4 ingredients of marital failure, basically, for Gottman. By contrast, couples who were able to have at least 5 positive interactions for each negative interaction. Lots of affirmation, lots of gratitude, lots of other kinds of positive interactions were much more likely to forge strong and stable unions. So the work of Gottman and his team suggested a few behavioral techniques, a kind word here, humble request for forgiveness there, paired with a generally positive orientation towards your spouse, held out the key to forging a good marriage. Now, when it comes to kind of describing the microclimate of marriage, I don't doubt that Gottman is really obviously onto something. But what this model clearly, I think, and what many population books clearly don't sort of tell us and don't explain for us, right, is why some communities, why some places, why some groups of people are more likely to succeed at marriage today than are others. And these are kind of more sociological issues and questions that Gottman's method, his love lab, couldn't answer very well for at least me. So I want to kind of think about different kinds of love labs, neighborhoods, for instance. So kind of thinking about this, this question of why is it that in the neighborhood adjacent to where Gottman ran his love lab, the hip Wallingford neighborhood in central Seattle, why did this neighborhood have some of the strongest families in the Emerald City? By contrast, why was a neighborhood like Rainier Valley to the south of the Love Lab on the western shore of Lake Washington dominated by one-parent families in Seattle? Surely it wasn't because one neighborhood had read and inwardly digested Gottman's best-selling book, The Relationship Cure, a 5-step guide to strengthening your marriage, family relationships, and one had not. Perhaps it's something to the fact that Wallingford had twice the household income and half the poverty, as did the neighborhood in the Rainier Valley. That was really more about the sort of the story here. And indeed, when my colleague Wendy Wong and I looked at data from Raj Chetty's Opportunity Atlas, a fascinating new atlas that allows you to kind of look at neighborhood patterns across the nation, we found there's a very clear connection depicted here on the screen between income at the neighborhood level and the share of single-parent families in neighborhoods. So that suggests to us that part of the story here is about class. Part of the story here is about money. But unfortunately, Raj Chetty's data does not have information really on culture per se, or really much information on ethnicity. So we wanted to kind of look at some data we had on religion in counties across the U.S., as well as some data on income and education in counties across the U.S. And in doing that, we found is that counties that had often more religious residents were more likely to have more married parent families in those counties. In fact, look at kind of the top 4 counties in America when it comes to married parenthood. What you find is that 3 of those 4 counties are exceptionally religious compared to other counties in America. So the number 1 county, not surprisingly, is Utah County in Utah, the home of Provo, where there are a lot of Mormons. The number 2 county, which I had not heard before, doing this research, is Geauga County in Ohio, where there are disproportionately high numbers of Amish families. And then the number 4 county is Williamson County in Tennessee, that has comparatively high numbers of evangelicals. So this kind of gave us, from sort of the county level perspective, a sense that perhaps religion was part of the story about the masters of marriage. And then we wanted to think about ethnicity too, and it's sort of, in that sense, looking at kind of the national lab, if you will, was the most efficient way to do that. And in doing that, we found that Asians in America are much more likely to get and stay married compared to other groups in the U.S. So when you put all this together and you look at a data set like the General Social Survey, what you find is that today in America, there are really kind of 3 groups that enjoy the most stable marriages in America. Those 3 groups are what I call strivers, that is college-educated Americans, religious Americans, and especially Asian Americans. You kind of can see on the screen up here how, again, Americans who are college-educated are less likely to get divorced. Americans who are more religious are less likely to get divorced, and particularly how Asians are the least likely to get divorced here in the U.S. But because we're concerned not just with sort of family stability, but also sort of the quality of family life, we took a look at marital happiness using the GSS. We found basically a similar pattern here, but what we see also, particularly kind of in a multivariate context, is that here the religious tend to do best and the Asians tend to do the worst, which in some ways, of course, makes sense, because if you're really committed to marital stability, you're probably more likely to hold on even when things are pretty rough in your marriage. So when you put all this together, what you see is that in looking at Americans who are in intact marriages with children, is that a large share of them are constituted by either strivers or religious Americans or Asian Americans. And I should be clear here too that for these three groupings, you could be both an Asian and religious and a striver. Or you could be, for instance, a striver who is neither religious nor Asian. But what we do see when it comes to intact marriages in America is that a clear majority of adults in that grouping are either strivers or religious or Asians. Now, in making sense of this, in thinking about kind of what's happening to family in America and thinking about the marriage divide in America, I think the left tends to sort of focus on class, on social structure, and on public policy. And there are certainly ways in which what I'm seeing in this data would correspond to or conform to the kind of progressive vision about family life. What we see in this data and in the research on this sort of topic is that things like having a guy stably employed is a big predictor of marriage and marital stability. Men who are stably employed are much more likely to get married in the first place, and they're less likely to get divorced in the second place. We'll see too that having fewer money problems is linked to higher quality marriages, not surprisingly. And we see too that people who have a house and people who have a good 401k are not surprisingly much less likely to end up in divorce court. Okay, so in all these kinds of ways, sort of the progressive narrative about the importance of money and class, I think, is kind of vindicated. But this three-part grouping also has something to offer, I think, for the right, which tends to think about the marriage divide more in terms of values and virtues. Because the presence of the religious Americans and the Asian Americans among the masters of marriage clearly tells us that our family divide is not simply about dollars and cents. It's also about what we most value and the virtues and vices that define our ordinary lives. I'm still in exploration mode here, but my conversations with Asian Americans, religious Americans, and strivers are suggestive of the ways in which culture plays a role in strengthening and stabilizing family life in America. So Asians have what I call a kind of dreamer familism, where they draw on their own traditions of familism to realize the American dream for themselves and especially for their kids. And when I use the term familism, what I mean by that is that people have values and virtues that sustain strong marriages, an intense parenting ethic, and the capacity to put the welfare of the family above the individual. So when I talked, for instance, to Lisa Lee, a Korean American living just across the Potomac in Virginia, it was clear that things like education and her kids' long-term welfare were kind of paramount in how she was approaching life. And she talked about how growing up in Pennsylvania, how, quote, marriage and family relationships were incredibly important to the fabric of the entire Korean immigrant culture in her networks. And now as a wife and as a mother herself, she says, we teach our children to have respect for their parents and for teachers and for family. And we teach our kids that there is no one more important than your family, unquote. Obviously, a lot of familism in that statement. And it's also obviously shaping how she thinks about marriage. Romance is not her first priority in her marriage. Sort of laughingly, she said to me, it may sound, quote, really cold to say that it's an economic partnership, but in some ways it is. And the project of raising our children is at the moment the overwhelming priority for us until they are out of the house and financial independence. This kind of gives you a sense of dreamer familism in action for Asian Americans. For religious Americans, what I see is the familism is less about tradition and success, including education, and more about principle and piety. Okay? Family relationships are endowed with sacred significance by the Christians, Jews, and Muslims who dominate Americans' religious scene. Religious rituals, texts, and networks stress the importance of following particular norms like fidelity and forgiveness, for instance. And more than Asian or strivers, the familism we see among religious folks focuses more on strengthening the marriage bond per se. So consider, for instance, the life of Kim Davis. It's a 38-year-old African-American woman from the Atlanta area. When I talked to her, she talked about her sort of faith motivating her to continuously, quote, work on it, that is the marriage, quote, unquote, from regularly kissing her husband to other small acts of service to kind of give life to her love for her husband. Quote, whatever it takes to make the other person feel good. That's what you have to continue, as opposed to being selfish and thinking that I have that person and that's it. So her kind of thinking, her kind of reflections on marriage are emblematic of this religious familism and of the importance that it accords to towards the nuptial relationship. Strivers possess what I call amoral familism. This is a term that was first coined by Ed Bainfield in a study of Southern Italian families many, many years ago. What I mean by this term today, I think, is that strivers personally embrace the values and virtues that sustain strong and stable families for themselves and for their kids. They shy away from embracing or even actively reject these very same values in public. Okay? This kind of was, exemplified for me in talking to Paul Wilson, a 46-year-old Silicon Valley executive working for one of the big three companies in the Valley. He was talking about how kind of there's a big family diversity push at his company. So I asked him to kind of talk about family. He said, I'd say family is what you define it, full stop. But then when he kind of went on to talk about his own kids and his own marriage, I think the language shifts in ways that are pretty apparent. He says, quote, I've seen the benefits of being a team, talking about his wife and himself, and trying to raise kids. I think if you took the average single-parent household, the average marriage household, you'd probably find a bit more happiness or less stress in the married household. So I have a propensity towards that. I'll talk to you about his marriage as a partnership. And partnership is the term that strivers tend to use for marriage. He says, I think marriage is to me analogous with the partnership you have with someone. It's about that unconditional mutual support with someone where you're really focused on their person's well-being and prosperity, happiness in the long run. Okay, so again, publicly tolerant of a variety of family forms and expressions, but privately much more familistic, focused on one's kids, focused on being a good partner to your spouse and raising them and forging a good family for them and for you down the road. Okay, so just to conclude with our thinking about familism. So I think part of what's happening here too, particularly for the strivers and for Asian Americans, is there's a kind of either implicit or explicit recognition that this kind of familism is crucial for their ability to realize the American dream and for their kids' ability to recognize the dream. And this is a wise assumption or a wise insight or a wise tactic because there's a lot of research out there telling us about how kids are more likely to excel in school, they're more likely to graduate from college, telling us how household incomes are higher, poverty is lower, and men's and women's assets as they move into retirement are in a better position when folks are stably married and, of course, when folks are investing, a lot in their children. So it's clearly the case that familism, different stripes obviously here, is the sort of the best path to realize the American dream on average. Indeed, if you think deeply about the studies that are on this slide, they turn the left's argument about economics and family upon its head. Strong families lead to better economic outcomes, not just vice versa. It's sort of one, I think, insight from this slide. So let me conclude by making 3 final points here. Points about sort of the state of our unions here in America today. The first point is a positive point. I think we need to do more to herald the good news. We need to do more to recognize that there's too little hope and too much ignorance out there about marriage and family life among our young adults today. They need to know marriage remains the gold standard when it comes to love and family life. They need to know that given the decline in divorce, there's real cause also for hope for those who are willing to risk new love and new life in America today. So we need to kind of broadcast this good news about marriage and family in America out there. We also have to confront the bad news. The news about our nation's deep marriage divide and the news about its falling fertility rate. We need new policies on the Hill, policies that stop penalizing marriage and start rewarding work more for ordinary Americans, as well as policies that make childbearing easier for working class and poor Americans. But what ails the American family isn't going to be cured just by some new policy package from Washington. I'm sure you all understand and appreciate. We're going to have to also change the culture as well. Our schools, our media, our pop culture, and yes, even our universities are going to have to start telling the truth about the family, about the ways in which certain types of values and virtues are more likely to sustain strong marriages and stable families, and even the American dream itself. The elites who control the commanding heights of our culture are going to have to stop this delicate dance where they do one thing in private and then say an entirely different thing in public. No, they don't have to preach what they practice, as Charles has argued. All they have to do is tell the truth. The truth about the good and the great times, but also the terrible times, as well as the quotidian times that they have and they are experiencing in forging family-first marriages in 21st century America. The alternative to confronting this bad news head-on, of course, is to accept a world where the United States devolves into a separate and unequal family regime where strong and stable families are for the masters of marriage alone, and where everyone else is consigned to increasingly unstable, unhappy, and unworkable ones. That is, to a world where scores of our fellow Americans are consigned to diminished dreams, greater alienation, and to ending their lives as they live them, alone. I hope you can join me in hoping that that is not our alternative future for America going forward. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Brad, for a characteristically rich and thought-provoking talk. I'm Yuval Levin. I'm a scholar here at AEI. It is my happy task to moderate a conversation about the questions that Brad raised for us, about the subject he took up, with 4 really wonderful interlocutors who are distinctly and uniquely well-suited, I think, to taking up this set of questions with us. I'll tell you a bit about each of them, and then we'll see what they made of Brad's talk and go from there, and bring all of you into the conversation after a bit with some Q&A. David Brooks, over on the right, is a columnist at the New York Times, of course, and director of Weave, which is a project of the Aspen Institute aimed at bridging differences that divide Americans and seeking common ground. He's the author of many books, most recently The Second Mountain. Kathy Eden is a professor of sociology and public affairs at the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton, one of the country's leading experts in poverty research and the intersections of welfare, work, family life, and neighborhood. She's the author of many books and most recently co-author of the award-winning book, Coming of Age in the Other America. Richard Reeves is the Whitehead Chair and Senior Fellow in Economic Studies at the Brookings Institution. He's co-director of its Center on Children and Families. Richard's work focuses on the middle class, on inequality and social mobility, and he is most recently the author of Dream Hoarders. And next to me here, Wesley Yang is a wonderful essayist and author who's emerged in the past few years as one of the most provocative writers on race and identity in American life, the author of The Souls of Yellow Folk, and many essays and articles at the New York Times Magazine, at Harper's, New York Magazine, Esquire, Tablet, and many other places. I thought we could start by just giving each of you a chance to react a little bit to what Brad had to say, and we can see where our conversation goes from there. So we'll take it in order and start with David.
Okay, first I sympathize with Brad trying to teach marriage to UVA students. I teach a course at Yale my students call Therapy with Brooks, which in part is about how to choose a marriage partner, and they do not want to talk about this subject. One of my students said, marriage is a box that'll come in the mail when I'm 35. And I say, start planning now. It's an important decision, but I can't get them to do that. I want to second thank Brad for bringing the good news. It's typical for marriage scholars, and especially family scholars on the right, to just bring the bad news about how families are falling apart. So I think Brad is giving us a much more balanced view. I happen to think both Brad and Bell are right, which is, I think, probably what Brad thinks. But I guess I'd respond by saying, what's a family? In most of those slides, with one significant exception, the Asian American slide, the photographs, it was two parents and a kid, and kids. And so why would we think that's a family? If we go around the world, the most common family form is the extended family, not the nuclear family. If we go through history, the most common family form is the extended family, not the nuclear family. You can go through the graves of hunter-gatherer societies 25,000 years ago, and there are usually 25 or 30 people who are vaguely related to each other, but who lived as chosen family. So why do we think the two-parent family is the family? And I'd say it's because the 1950s happened, and our images of family were frozen then. And that was not a typical period in American life. It was a very freakish period in American life when two-parent nuclear families really did thrive. They thrived because a lot of moms were locked in the home because of sexism. They thrived because they lived in very tight neighborhoods, which were basically extended family in other form. And they thrived because every single social indicator helped nuclear families. High union membership, high church attendance, high wages for men. It was a freakish moment, and it ended. And as soon as it ended, the nuclear family did what it tends to do, which is it started falling apart. And it had fallen apart when it started in the early 20th century, and it fell apart in the 60s and 70s, and it was undercut economically, was also undercut psychologically and socially by a wave of individualism that, as Kathy and others have written, have redefined what family is for. It was less about raising children and more about individual fulfillment. And so we went through this bad period of 30 or 40 years where we made life more free for individuals and worse for kids and families. And a lot of conservatives wrote a lot of books about all that, and a lot of progressives did too. But people adjust. And so I think one of the best things about Brad's presentation is it shows how people adjust. I think the adjustment is slightly different. I think, as Brad said, at the top of society among the religion among Asian Americans, there's a revival of two-parent families. And if you are extremely wealthy, you can buy an extended family and create a successful nuclear family. And if you have a strong religious community and a strong Asian American community, you can do that. So I think that rise of what you might call human capital familism is coming back as people realize how much they have to invest in their kids to give them a successful life. And divorce is now, it used to be liberation, now it's a tragedy. So that is one piece. But I don't think that kind of nuclear familism is going to spread much farther than those three communities. And I question whether it's the right move to spread them. I think there are two other forms of familism that'll scoop up most of society. The first is the revival of the extended family, the most ancient family form. If you look at kids in their 20s, they're moving back home with mom and dad. If you look at grandparents, they're moving back in, either directly in the home with kids or next door or nearby. And so when home builders ask adults now, do you want an in-law suite for your kids, what they call a millennial suite or a senior suite, 42% of home buyers say, yeah, I need that.
Wow.
And so if you see these development projects, they have one gas line to stay within zoning code, but they have separate front doors, separate kitchenettes for what is becoming the new extended family. A record high for the 20th century or 21st century, 64 million Americans are now living in extended families. It should be said that only 19% of Americans live in families with 2 parents and kids. 81% live in something else. Most American adults are single, not married. So that's one form, the new extended family. And then the third thing, which I'll close on, is the new forged family. In the 1980s, when gays and lesbians were suffering from the AIDS crisis in San Francisco, they created this concept called the chosen family. They had nobody else to rely on, they were in trauma, so they basically created non-kin families. And to me, in the wreckage of the nuclear family, a lot of people are creating non-kin families or partially kin families. I'm part of one in DC. We've got about 40 kids whose family structure really broke for them. And so we've got 8 adults and about 40 or 50 kids. They're now like in their 20, they're now 20 or so. But we have a basic chosen family with each other. And we sort of live as a part of an extended clan. And this Weave project, which is really community builders around the country, are creating forged families all around the country. I could describe 1,000 different circumstances where people are taking people who are scooped up from the broken families and creating new sort of extended families. So I basically agree with what Brad said. We are in a moment of family revival, but I'd say it's not quite just the revival of the nuclear family, it's revival of an extended family and the creation of new family forms which are partially non-kin. And so that's overall good news.
Hard to follow that. If you haven't read David's new book, there's a wonderful description of that family of choice in the book. So I mainly hang out and talk to people. I've talked to, I think, thousands of low-income couples who are on the other side of Brad's slides. They're mostly disadvantaged economically, and they're part of disadvantaged racial and ethnic groups. I've also served on the Oklahoma Marriage Initiative Advisory Board with Bill and Ron and watched that policy effort over the last decade very closely. But I want to make 3 basic comments. First, ironically, when we talk to these low-income couples, what we see is that those great marriages, the move toward these higher quality, longer lasting marriages among the middle class and among whites have only served to rise the standards for the kind of folks I talk to. So Ernest told me, we were asking him why marriage had become rare in his neighborhood in Philadelphia. This is a low-income African-American father, and he said, people don't really know nothing about love, or they know about the 4-letter word, but I'm talking about that insane love. The love to where you will do anything for this person. You will stand out in the rain until she stand at the window and until the lights go on. That's how much you love this person, just unconditional love to where there was nothing you won't do for this person. So we hear this over and over again in our interviews, this rarefied, fantastic vision of marriage that I actually believe in and luckily participate in. But this is very much what Ernest and others that we interview in low-income communities are holding out for. Second, and David alluded to this, the marriages of those in the, I don't like the word striver, I might offer that as a criticism, in the non-striver and in the non-white or Asian camps, are forming families really differently. They're forming marriages really differently. Most single parents do get married. They get married in their 30s, and they often get married to people who are not the fathers of all or even any of their children. I've had a front row seat to watching this all because I am the principal investigator, having taken over from Sarah McClanahan of the Fragile Families and Child Wellbeing Survey. Last summer, we were out interviewing 19-year-olds and their parents, and we saw astonishingly that most of these parents now in their early 30s had achieved stability, just like their 30-year-old counterparts in the striver class. Of course, they had children about 10 years, 15 years earlier, but they had really achieved stability. And we saw 2 kinds of marriages. First of all, what we call the super stepfathers. These are social fathers who the teenagers said had made a significant difference in their lives and were playing a very positive role. So one young man, again in Philadelphia, told me, "My father made me a person, but it was my stepfather who made me a man." Even more common was when the new partner was accepted by the teenager and respected as an important father figure. But the youth still maintained a close relationship with his bio dad. And these three people were all playing an important role. We might think of this as a Three's Company parenting arrangement. So Brad calls us to make marriage more, the culture more marriage friendly. I think we need to really think about how to support and nurture these families that are formed with children in tow. Finally, I appreciate that it's not all class. But identifying the solution is not the same as identifying the cause. And as a social scientist, I have to ask, what do we know empirically about what makes the folks that I talk to, what makes their relationships last? What can increase the prevalence of two-parent families? Now, we know from our experience in Oklahoma that direct intervention, teaching relationship skills can sometimes help. We managed to move the needle slightly in Oklahoma in the percentage of fathers living continuously with their children in their home. 6 percentage points, I believe. 20% and 6 percentage points. Thank you, my colleague and friend. But what else do we know? Well, first of all, in Promises I Can Keep, which I wrote with Maria Kafalas based on interviews with 165 low-income single moms in Philadelphia, we learned that they held to this white picket fence dream, this marriage bar, this basket, this rich basket of things they needed to achieve before they could marry. Christina Gibson Davis and her colleagues have operationalized this using Building Strong Families data. They found that when that bar was achieved, and it's a modest bar, it increased marriage by 2/3. Second, we know that career academies, which was not focused on marriage at all. This was an alternative high school with caring teachers, small classrooms focused on a vocational theme, had striking impacts. In fact, their most striking impacts on indicators of family formation. What it represents is a 23% increase in two-parent households for the academy group versus the non-academy group. So this is amazing, right? Caring teachers, a sense of meaning and identity at a critical life point in late adolescence has a 23% impact on the likelihood that you'll be in a two-parent family 8 years later. So investments in young people matter. Maybe even more astonishingly is the Perry Preschool at 40 report. So Perry Preschool, of course, was an excellent 4-year-old program for young children who are from very poor backgrounds. And here we see 40 years later, almost a doubling of those males raising their own children. So I'll stop there. Turn it over to Richard.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be on this panel, and congratulations to Brad for his work. Among the many positive points, I like the shift from psychology to sociology in this space, maybe a bit less Gottman and a bit more Eden, if I can put it that way. That said, the 5-to-1 rule of being nice 5 times more often than you're nasty to your spouse is, I think, a takeaway for many people in this room. So just in case my wife is watching online, I just want to say that she's brilliant, beautiful, kind, great mom, and incredibly forgiving.
You notice it's 1 to 5 in academia? It goes the other way. The ratio is the
That's right. It seems to be the case. I'll make 4 brief points. The first is, I think there is broad agreement that as far as kids are concerned, that stability and security predict their success in various measures. There's very little disagreement about that. The real question, I think, is how best to provide that, and whether the whether the nuclear family built around that marital relationship is necessarily the best way to achieve it. So I think David's points about extended family and kin are very important. And Brad mentioned the work from Raj Chetty on predicting upward mobility. One of the most striking recent findings is that the upward mobility of black boys is strongly predicted by the presence of fathers in the neighborhood, independent of their own father being present. So there's something about there being dads around that helped black boys to succeed regardless of whether their own father was there. And so actually I think Brad's pushing us to think beyond the individual towards the nuclear family unit, and I suspect we need to make the next move too, which is to think more to the community and think as much about social capital too. So I think that's one point. And actually, if you take the example of J.D. Vance, who's very often quoted in these sorts of circles and his work Hillbilly Elegy, his mother was constantly getting married. She just had horrible marriages with horrible people that ended badly, and he eventually got some security by living with his grandmother. And I won't, there's a lovely quote in his book where he talks about the fact that as soon as he moved in with his grandmother, he knew where he was going to live every year, he knew where he was going to go to school every year, and his life wasn't contingent on the romantic decisions of the people around him. So he found stability and security with an extended family. So I think that's point number one on the stability security thing. And I will just say, and this could be a big digression, but it was missing largely from Brad's talk, which is that we know that most births that take place outside marriage are unintended to some extent or other. And the work on fragile families really supports this. And so I think that to have a balanced discussion about this, we really do have to talk about the role of unintended pregnancy in creating instability. When we say that cohabiting parents are more likely to break up, we just can't be blind to the fact that most co-parenting parents weren't planning to become parents together, by and large. And that might be driving instability as much as the fact that they happen to be married at the time or not. And that raises questions of access to effective contraception, reproductive health care, etc. Second point, and here I'm going to use the phrase from the philosopher John Elster, who talks about commitment devices. And the idea, I think, of marriage, to come back to the marriage point, is helping people to meet their long-term goals, even as they face short-term pressures and temptations. And I think any of us who are married can understand that a marriage can have that kind of commitment device feel. The question is commitment to what end? And it can be for different ends. I think certainly to provide a good environment for children and increasingly to invest heavily in their human capital. It could be to share economic risks and economic resources. It could be to provide reciprocal care for each other at the times that we need it. But I think that sense of acting as a way to commit ourselves to each other rather for the long term remains a powerful argument in favor of marriage. And it may be one of the reasons why, even just in the few years since same-sex marriage has been legal, more than half of same-sex couples have now chosen to marry. And so I think that in terms of revealed preference, actually looking at what's happening to same-sex couples is a really interesting case point. Third point I want to make is this distinction that I think we need to make between different kinds of marriage, which Brad alluded to. We have the religious marriages. He describes the Christians who are getting married. And there, really, I think we have to think about the marriage as a sacramental institution. It's highly integrated with people's spiritual sense. It's faith-based, clearly very important in and of itself as a sacrament. And then for what he calls the strivers, we might think of more of a contractual basis of marriage, which is more skill-based. There may be more exit power in those kinds of marriages. And actually the skills that you need to succeed in that marriage may also be skills that spill over into parenting, for example. And so if you like, you have faith-based marriages which are more sacramental and skill-based marriages which are more contractual. We might get an interesting test of that in the UK now, because as of 10 days ago, heterosexual couples are now able to have civil partnerships rather than marriages. So the history of this is that the UK introduced civil partnerships for same-sex couples who weren't able at that point to get married. We then introduced same-sex marriage, so it's now possible for same-sex couples to get married. But then a heterosexual couple immediately sued and said, well, they were being discriminated against because they weren't allowed to have a civil partnership, which brings the legal benefits of marriage largely, but doesn't have the kind of sacramental feel of a marriage. And so as we see more and more couples in the UK choosing that route, even though they're heterosexual, maybe that gives us a nice natural experiment. And the last point I want to make, and I'm very conscious of Catherine sitting next to me as I say this, but I'd like to get the question of the extent to which this is a problem of men onto the table. Obviously, Brad alluded to that. But if we think about college, which he used as a marker for strivers, well, 3 in 5 undergraduates now are women. If we take religion as a marker, well, 3 in 5 of the people worshipping in any given institution are now women. And so we are seeing some issues with men. The only men who've seen an increase in their wages are those with a 4-year college degree. The role of husband and father has been very seriously influenced by the success of the women's movement in increasing women's economic independence, which I think most of us in this room would welcome, the rise in women's economic independence, but we should also recognize that that means that for men, that's going to change their role as fathers and as husbands. And as it was Martin Good who wrote an essay in 1982 called Why Men Resist, and he observed, quotes, "The underlying shift is towards the decreasing marginal utility of males." It's a wonky phrase, but it carries a sort of chilling truth to it. And so I think one of the questions that we should address directly is whether or not, the extent to which, rather, the problems that we do still face in some marriages are to a very large extent the problems of men.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. There was just sort of one tension, I'm not sure I want to call it a contradiction, in sort of listing of the virtues of sort of legacy Asian, we can call them Confucian values, and promulgating a kind of feminism. Because, of course, one of the early slides that we saw showed that a place where the culture of childbearing had entirely fallen apart was, of course, Japan, right? And, of course, and if you look at the figures of Asian Americans, childbirth rates in America, they're the lowest of any group in America. So Asian Americans are the least likely to divorce, but they're also the most likely to have no children or one child, or overall have they give birth to something like 1.5 children per woman. So we do have the strength of the sort of Confucian familism on the one hand, but then we have a sort of integration into meritocratic striverdom, which is a big part of what Asian Americans do when they come here. And of course, there is a robust model of sort of meritocratic striver families in the partnership model that do function and then tend to sort of stay together. But I think also there, like the number of children is lower, and so and then there's heavier investment in the children that they have, and so each of those children, there'll be more there'll be more only children in that cohort, and they will be subject to the conditions that an only child or a smaller family will encounter. I was just thinking the other day, and this is something that I tweeted out, that large families produce very disparate roles, right? So the older children will take responsibility for the younger children, and so there'll be the oldest child who is sort of a quasi-parental figure for his siblings, and then there will be a youngest sibling that is buffered from direct parental authority by many other children, and so will be independent in a way that like other children will not be, in the absence of that kind of family structure. And so the particular kind of responsibility that kind of structure fosters in the world, increasingly I think we're going to see it disappearing from the world, and the particular form of independence that comes with being sort of buffered from direct parental authority by a large brood that you compete with, that sort of provide you, that sort of sometimes will bully you, right? And sometimes will give you sort of experience in the give and take, all within the context of sort of an overarching sense of familial love, right? Like those things are all going to be absent in our next cohort. And I think there is some reason to suspect that what we think of as snowflakeism in its various iterations may be related to this. We have a lot of sort of strivery children, high investment children from meritocratic families that simply weren't did not encounter the same kind of sort of crucible of social experience that a large family provides. And I don't know if there's any research that looks into this. I'm sure there are probably novels or other sort of anecdotal sources of data that talk about this. But when you think about a world of only children, and it's a different kind of world. And so, but going back to the sort of the Asian American thing, yeah, so there are these familistic values in Asia, just as there are in sort of Southern Europe, and those are the places that all have, in the midst of their transition, their very recent transition into modernity, seen their birth rates collapse more than any other place, right? Like in Italy and Spain and Japan, and also in China, of course, which sort of had state policy whose purpose was to drastically sort of result in that outcome, and is now attempting, they've removed the one-child policy, but the rate still keeps going down, right? So there may be something about these familialistic values that are sort of something uniquely dysfunctional, actually, right, about them, or sort of uniquely and I don't have any answers. I'm just pointing out that there is this weird thing where we're praising these values, and yet one of the countries that is the sort of birthplace of it, Japan, has the lowest birth rates and is dying off in the way that he describes. And that the Asian American community here that is a beneficiary of those legacy values gives birth at a lowest rate. Another little thing that didn't appear in the presentation, but that was in the actual paper that was of interest to me, was the finding that sort of Asian Americans are the most likely to have stable families. But the stable families were not premised on the happiness within the marriage. And of course, this comports entirely with my own experience of the Asian American marriage. It was one that was held together not by sort of the five complement to one, but simply by a cultural norm that existed, sort of psychologically, because there wasn't the same kind of community to provide, sort of the sanctions that held families together under previous dispensations, sort of like a moralistic, or you're not surrounded by people that are going to regard you as a pariah if you get married, but you will regard yourself as a pariah when you get married, to the extent that you are a bearer of sort of Confucian ideology as your basis. So these families held together for that reason, and their children who were raised within that setting still seem to be holding together, but they just don't have a lot of kids. So that's where we are.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for all those comments. There's a lot there to work with, and I want to also be cognizant of the extraordinary audience we have and draw people in. I wonder if I can ask one question of all of you before we do that, drawing really on the extraordinarily interesting point that Wesley just made. I wonder, David, you started by highlighting the mixed news, the good news in what Brad had to say. It strikes me that the good news isn't that good, because it's basically a way of saying that there are fewer children. Yeah. Sure, there are fewer children outside of marriage. There are fewer children. There's less divorce because there's less marriage. And Brad describes this as selectivity. We're more selective about it. But doesn't that mean we just have less marriage and fewer children? And isn't that a bad thing, or is it?
Yeah, I think it's a bad thing. But I want the one thing I hadn't thought of until Wesley was speaking was the psychological effects of low fertility. Mm-hmm. And I imagine the Chinese have a lot to tell us about this. I would be curious to ask them. But I think about, in my own life, first on the kids who are in the selective family class, who I see at Yale. My colleague, Daniel Markovitz, wrote this book called The Meritocracy calculating how much, when we as upper educated parents, how much we invest in our kids by taking them to the theater and to the museums and all that. And if you put a numerical quantity on that, he calculated it would be about $10 million per kid. And so these massive investments in these kids. And I would say of my students, about a third suffer from the effects of conditional love. That the beam of love beams strongly on the kid when he or she does something that will lead to career success, and when it doesn't, the beam of love is withdrawn, and the most elemental relationship in their kids' lives is conditional, and therefore they're terrified and they're at risk. And the explosion of depression on campuses has to be somehow related to this. There's a thing called the text crisis line, where people text their suicidal thoughts instead of calling in. And the first thing to know is they have to figure out when are the people serious about suicide. And the number one word that correlates with suicide, real suicidal ideation, is the word ibuprofen. It's not suicide. But when the people are actually in pain and they're taking Advil, that's pay attention to that one. But the most troubling one, which reminds me of this, is there are 80 different psychological maladies that come to the hotline, whether it's anxiety, depression, bipolar, and they do a little word cloud of what word appears in each of these 18 maladies. The number one word in all 18 is the word mom. And so it's some extremely intense and dysfunctional relationship with mom that is contributing to this. And then finally, on the bottom of the income scale, I have run into a couple people who had come from these gigantic families. A guy named Marquis in Detroit, African-American guy, and he said, my mom had 9 brothers, my dad had 7 siblings. I just had a lot of people rooting for me when I was growing up. I have a colleague named Isabel Soto, came from Colombia, again, gigantic family. She said, I didn't know you could get paid for babysitting until I went to college. And so you take away all that, and what sound like pretty good families, and it's like no siblings. That sounds like a deterioration, which I haven't thought about till you said that.
Kathy, on this point, is a society with fewer children but also fewer social dysfunctions an improvement?
Well, one thing that's, I think, been consistent in our work with moms, and maybe especially low-income dads, is the degree to which children have become central sources of meaning. Of course, we've always thought about this with mothers, but for men, there has been a revolution. It's hit middle-class men, but especially poor men. We've interviewed hundreds of them in Philadelphia, Camden, other locations across the country, Charleston, South Carolina, San Antonio, Texas. Men who are in the most dire straits see children as the chief reason for living, for getting up in the morning, for straightening out their lives, for getting off drugs, for staying true to the conditions of their parole. Now, it's a very powerful narrative, and as I think this corresponds with something Richard said, as men have been sort of pushed out, I think we argue this in our book, Doing the Best I Can, my co-author is right over there, Tim Nelson. As we've sort of pushed men, kind of out of the provider role in this part of the income distribution, they have at the same time really taken on the father role. And in fact, in many ways, what men want to do is be more like mom. They're de-emphasizing provision, de-emphasizing marriage altogether, but not de-emphasizing parenthood and children. So you have this very interesting paradox where the attachment to the institution of marriage may be weaker, but the attachment to the role of father may actually be stronger. So I think it's pretty worrying for these men in particular. Now, they struggle to do right by their children, and we haven't crafted public policy that's very helpful beyond the policy I talked about earlier. So it's a bit of a paradox, but there is reason to worry, I think.
I'm reminded when I went from 2 children to 3 children, and I called my brother to tell him that, who'd had some experience of this, and he used a soccer analogy, so I apologize in advance, but he said, you think it's not that big a change from 2 to 3, but it's a massive change. When there's 2 of them, you can mark them one-on-one. When it's 3, you have to resort to a sweeper defense. But it probably applies to different sports too. And it's something about the intensity of it. So I think this buffering point is interesting. I'm glad we've raised this issue of fertility because it's sometimes presented now as just a self-evident problem. And I think we really need to examine why we think it's a problem. It's been very interesting that many of the people who are like very good social conservatives who are very worried about teen pregnancy and non-marital births and so on are now really worried about the drop in fertility, much of which is caused by the fall in teen pregnancy and non-marital births.
That's right.
And so it is really interesting to see where that kind of argument lands. Is it worse? Well, we have got this interesting question now. Is it bad to have single children? Yes or no? I think that's an empirical question. I don't think we have a good empirical answer to it, frankly, and so I don't think we should necessarily assume it's bad. Then there's the loneliness thing that might happen just as a result of less. Well, there are other ways to solve that through extended families, different communities, mixed neighborhoods. So I don't think we should just assume on its face that it's socially bad. Is it economically bad? That's the other argument that's made, and Brad alluded to this. Well, yes, but there are ways you can solve that by immigration policy, for example. So just let more people in if that's an issue. But if we're serious,
What could go wrong?
So I'm just trying to bring this kind of to a sharp point in terms of policy. If we think it's a problem, and I'm not convinced that it is, and it seems to me the best argument is the economic one. Well, we can have a more liberal immigration policy, or we can have more pro-natalist policies. Will they work, is the first question. Well, maybe, but the evidence is a bit mixed. But let's also be clear that if they did work, it would accelerate our progress towards a majority-minority country, because there's a disproportionate number of the women who are of childbearing age are Hispanic and black, particularly Hispanic. I have no problem with that, but I just think we need to be aware of what's at stake here. A pro-natalist policy wouldn't do very much to bump up the number of white kids being born. It would bump up the number of particularly Hispanic kids being born. And so I just think it's important to be clear where we're going with all these arguments, even if we're convinced, as I am not yet, that on its face, declining fertility is necessarily a self-evidently bad thing.
Can I just raise one issue?
Please.
I do think you raised the issue earlier of how people in the folks in the non-striver class and who are disadvantaged in other ways tend to, the typical pregnancy results from an unplanned birth.
Yes.
So we've done a lot of writing about that. Sort of planned and it's sort of not planned. That's the magic, I think, of the qualitative is you get the ambiguity. But it is true that among these couples, the typical story is the relationship flows. There's not really a together couple there, and the relationship flows from a non-marital birth that two young people are trying to scrape it together to cope with. And of course, this doesn't usually lead to you finding your soulmate, which Ernest wants, right? So many of these relationships break up, and Ernest keeps looking for his soulmate, as well as Ernest's child's mother. And some of them eventually find stability through marriage in their 30s. But I think what we know is that when children are unplanned, not necessarily unwanted, but unplanned and poorly timed, this is bad for the kids and for the parents. So I just wanted to highlight work I did with the Gates Partnership on Mobility from Poverty. It's a large team of us, 25 of us who worked on issues that would really move the needle. And we did focus on family formation. And we know a lot about how to make sure every pregnancy is planned and well-timed. Access to contraception, absolutely critical, but also these investments in young people that I talked about earlier. When young people are encouraged to find a sense of meaning and identity through community service and volunteerism, we see dramatic declines in unplanned and early fertility. So I think I'm all for this. I've been friends with Brett for a long time. He's a straight shooter and a great researcher. And I love this sociological pitch. But let's go a step further and think about community in these broader ways. What does it say when the society says to young kids in Ypsilanti, Michigan, you are worth the very best preschool that we have ever devised? What kind of social signal does it send when you take kids in New York City and say, you can do it, and I care about you, I'm your teacher, and we're putting you in a small learning community, and we're going to go through high school together in this intimate, communal way. It's sending a very powerful social signal.
I just want to add, when I was in the UK government working on welfare reform, the minister asked someone running a teen pregnancy prevention program. This is when it was very high in the UK. And just said, look, there's one thing we can do to reduce the teen pregnancy rate. What is it? And this woman running it just said, give people more to lose. This kind of sense that actually if your life trajectory was that bad in the first place, then actually it's not probably a terribly irrational decision, right? It might seem like it for us, but actually having more to lose from being derailed is exactly, I think, what you're talking about in the pre-K. Sorry to interrupt.
Well, I want to draw in folks in the room, and I want to give people a chance also to ask Brad some questions. So I wonder if you just want to come up to the podium, Brad, and folks can ask the panel or you whatever they'd like. I'd only ask that you tell us who you are and try to put your question in the form of a question. Start up here. There's a microphone coming.
Hi, I'm Tim Carney. I'm a resident fellow here now, as of last week. Thank you, Yuval. And my question kind of going off of David's points and Catherine's points about sort of community. You have two different explanations for the sort of success of the strivers versus the religious groups. It's, you know, the best practices and the values, the virtues being taught. But isn't there a single explanation that could be offered, which would simplify this all, which is that they're both in strong communities with lots of institutions that they belong to that provide this meaning? Isn't that simpler explanation true and easier?
I think it's certainly part of the story, and it dovetails with David's comments about kind of the role of either the extended family or the functional equivalent for it. And I do think that particularly, Americans don't appreciate how much being a part of a strong either religious or secular community makes family life easier and better. And I talked tonight about sort of the way in which Asian families have the most stable marriages in America tonight, but I didn't tell you which group actually among Asians has the most stable marriages. And when you sort of raise the issue about sort of the Asian pattern, a lot of sort of scholars will talk about, well, there's a lot of diversity among Asians. We need to kind of acknowledge that. Well, it's true, there is diversity among Asians, but guess which group has the most stable marriages? It's Indian Americans, Americans who are either direct immigrants from India or second-generation immigrant Americans. So it's clearly the case that there is a way in which there's a community dynamic playing out for them, and obviously a focus on the family that's unique and powerful.
Let's take a question back there.
Hi, my name's Caitlin Rental. I'm a student at the University of Pennsylvania. I just had a question about interracial marriage, and especially with the rise of interracial marriage in America. Coming from an interracial marriage family, I'm not married yet. Myself, I was just curious on whether or not interracial marriage with this rise, that cultural aspect, especially with Asian Americans, will that decrease? Will other factors play more of a factor in the institution of marriage? And how will those values be perceived as people become, from different cultures and different backgrounds?
That's a great question. We actually have seen a pretty dramatic increase, obviously, in the last 20 or 30 years in interracial marriage across both racial and ethnic lines. But I don't yet know the answer to the question, but sort of how Americans who are, including Asian Americans who are marrying across compared to those who are marrying just within, in terms of, particularly for Asians. I think that's an important question I need to answer before I finish this new book project.
Can I say something?
Thoughts on the panel on that one? Yeah.
So there has been a big increase, but there's a huge difference by racial group. So the significant increase in interracial marriages, particularly for Hispanics and Asian Americans, and typically that's with a white spouse. The increase has been great, but from a very low base for Black Americans, but still remains very, very much lower for Black Americans. So what sociologists call outmarriage, marrying outside of your racial category, is much lower among Black Americans than it is among other Americans. And interestingly, it's much lower among Black women than Black men. So among those who do outmarry, from within a Black community, 2 of them are men for every 1 that's a woman. And that's created really interesting dynamics within those marriage markets, actually, because Black women are doing much better educationally, in some cases economically, but to the extent there's outmarriage, it tends to be Black men marrying out, and typically to white or Hispanic women, which is, I think, one factor behind the quite high rates of single parenthood among Black women. Because the Black men are marrying out. So I just think it's important to be sensitive to those huge racial differences within interracial marriage.
He's right up here in the front.
Yeah, hi, I'm Doug Wilkes. I'm the editor of the Deseret News in Salt Lake City. Question really for David and for Brad, perhaps. Are students really not interested in marriage, or have they lost the skill for dating and seeking a partner due to technology and any number of factors? And can you convince them?
Can you specifically?
Can I?
Yes,
Yeah,
you
no, I believe me.
You have a platform.
I preach.
But why do you think that is?
Yeah, I mean, the number, I'm going to slightly get this wrong, but in 1984, I think it's, don't quote me on the exact statistics, but the phenomenon is right, of say 26-year-olds, I think in 20 years ago, 33% were not in a romantic relationship, and now it's 51%. And so I noticed this in my college students and even in my high school. Most of us were dating. And most of my college students, they just say, I don't have time. And so I do think, I don't know about the data, that's my lived experience. And I will tell you my lived experience with the Weave Project. We go around and we spend a lot of time talking about relationships and whether relationship skills can be taught. And the groups that are most hungry for that are high school students who say, I just don't know how to do a friendship. I've never been on a date. What do you do on a date? And so I don't know, maybe you know if those skills can be taught. I hope so, because I'm spending a lot of time trying to find the right curricula. But in my experience, it's both. They put career first, and two, they're terrified with an actual relationship. These are broad generalizations.
So if you
None of which apply in Utah.
If you hang on long enough and teach PhD students, you find that they're all desperately searching online. So there comes a point. Holly Wood, one of my former students, wrote an amazing dissertation about this. But there's a bit of a gender asymmetry in which women are doing a lot of the emotional and physical labor of identifying and trying to sort through these torturous online dating schemes. So there does come a point because people want to have children and they somehow think they need to get married before they have them if they're middle class, even though they're avowedly against that idea for other people. That's what they're going to do.
That's your point.
Right, my
Wesley,
point,
you want to
yeah.
speak to this?
Yeah, well, I could be mistaken about this, but I think I recall seeing a graphic showing like how various people in relationships had met, and there's been this extraordinarily dramatic over the last 10 years increase in those who met through online dating, to the point where it may be something like 65%. And so like all other forms have atrophied as they have been disrupted by this very powerful and addicted way of meeting people. There was an essay I read recently, an excellent essay in the Point magazine about, it was a memoir of somebody being both on the academic market and on Tinder at the same time. And he has this amazing description of the sort of phenomenality of Tinder, where you put your thumb against the person's face and you swipe them and a huge no comes up, right? And you sort of become habituated to a certain kind of virtual disposability of relationships and of people. And does that alter your psychological sense of yourself in the world as a dating person? I mean, it does. So, yeah.
We've got time for one last question. You seem to feel strongly. Let's hear it.
Thank you. My name is Yaya Fanusi, immigrated from Africa in 1967 to this country. You need to do a study about African immigrants in America and their families, all generations. Marriage is tough on it. So you need to check that and find out the values that you were talking about, the Asian is the same. And also the extended family. Most of them now that are working 2 jobs, they don't have time. They bring their parents to spend time with the kids. In fact, when I was growing up, my father was in London. So I have a lot of other family members, males, and who raised me and things like that. And they're doing it also here now because many African immigrant families have 2 jobs, working long hours.
That's a fair point. I think one thing that we see, we've got a new report coming out next week on California, and in that report we find that both sort of normative support and kind of practical experience of sort of a stable married life is sort of higher across the board for immigrants in California. So not just Asian immigrants, but also African immigrants as well, for instance. So there's certainly, I think the immigrant story is kind of one more expression of some of the themes that we've talked about tonight. and it dovetails with some of the comments that David made initially too, about how, in some ways, having that strong extended family at your back can be a force of real strength, and even here in America today.
Well, let's thank Brad and thank our panel and thank all of you for coming. Appreciate it.